Adding paint to your leather projects is a great way to incorporate color, whether you're wanting something subtle that stands out or a whole lot of pop. But if you don't have much experience working with paint and leather, it can be a very irritating process and very challenging to get consistent results. And while I don't do a ton of paint work, anytime I do, a lot of you ask how I'm keeping it so vibrant and consistent. So I'm going to try and share with you what little knowledge and experience I do have. But if you know something that I don't, if you have any additional tips or techniques that could be beneficial to learn, then please leave them in the comments for the audience and myself to know. Like I said, this is something that I am still experimenting with often. I'm going to try and share with you guys what I've done in the past, what I'm doing now, what has worked, what hasn't worked. But this is all just from my personal experience. And like I said, I don't have a ton of it, but hopefully what I do share with you will be beneficial to you going forward. Before we start discussing paint, I want to actually talk about the leather itself first and hopefully let you know whether this particular video is the right video for you or not. So most of my experience, especially when it comes to painting on leather, is going to come from working with natural vegetable tanned leather, like you see right here and right here. So the way that these types of leathers are tanned is a very natural process, and because of this leather's properties and it basically being a raw material when it leaves the tannery, it is meant to actually be manipulated, carved, tooled, colored, and finished, kind of like I'm showing in these example pictures and videos of my work throughout this video. Now, on these oil tan and chrome tan leathers, I don't have a lot of experience working with these types of leathers. But these types of leathers have a lot more oils, fats, waxes, and chemicals involved in the tanning process, and these are more so going to be considered a finished leather when they leave the tannery. Now, I can't say this for certain because, like I said, I don't have much experience with these leathers, but I would think having all of those extra properties in the leather could potentially cause issues when it comes to painting on them. I don't know that for certain. If you do, then let me know in the comments. I'd love to know just because I don't have experience working with these. So just keep that in mind. If you're working on a project using these types of leathers, or maybe you're just wanting to paint on a pair of sneakers or something like that, there may be better video options out there. Throughout this video, I am primarily going to be talking from my experience, which comes from, again, working with natural vegetable tanned leather like this. So unlike leather dyes that are actually going to absorb into the fibers and permanently change the color of leather, these leather acrylic paints like I have right here are more so just going to sit on top of the leather, which is really important to know. Now, some of that color pigment might make its way down into the fibers, but the majority of paint is just going to sit on top of the leather, which makes applying these products and properly finishing them a little bit more difficult. So, a lot of the big issues that I've run into and that I am going to hopefully help you mitigate going forward after watching this video are going to be streaking, clumping, peeling, cracking, and then my personal all-time biggest issue and probably your issue, rub off. But in order to paint, we need supplies, so let me bring all of this back over here. Now, I have used some of the random crafting paint brands that are out there, but what I have more so drifted to almost completely is this Angelus brand leather paint. And there are other good leather paint options out there. I hear a lot of good stuff about the Alpha 6 brand, but for me personally, I have just invested in such a large spread of colors with Angelus that this particular product is what I primarily use. And from my understanding, this is a water-based acrylic paint, and kind of like that last clip I just showed you, leather is a very pliable and flexible material. And so this paint is actually designed to be flexible as well, to move with the leather and help mitigate some of those issues that I just mentioned, like cracking, flaking, or peeling. I'm not going to say this is a cure-all, but if you are experiencing some of those issues, you may consider investing in a higher quality paint like this to help combat those issues. From my experience, this paint has delivered fairly well compared to some of those other generic options that I have used. And Angelus has a huge variety of colors. This is just a small part of my collection. And they have a lot of complementary products to their paint, and they actually have a YouTube channel that is honestly probably better equipped to be speaking on this topic than I am. So I'll actually link Angelus's YouTube channel in the description, and you guys can go check it out. As far as applicators go, I normally just use simple paintbrushes like you see here. The type of paintbrush that you need to use can come into play depending on the area and the way that you're needing to apply your paint to your project. But just a simple paintbrush is my go-to route. You can actually use a sponge or even airbrush this paint. I don't have any experience with airbrushing, so you might check out Angelus's channel for more info on that. One thing I do want to talk about is you can see there is a difference in these little paintbrushes right here. And that is because I like to keep my dye brushes and my paint brushes separate. This paintbrush over here is a dedicated dye brush, and that is because you can see these bristles are permanently stained from using dye, and I like to keep my paint brushes separate, because if I were to use this brush right here with all of that extra dye residue in the paintbrush, it could potentially interfere with the paint. So I like to keep my paintbrushes separate. You can see there's just a little bit of dried up paint on the tip of this that needs to be cleaned off, but otherwise the bristles are fairly clean. I clean these brushes out every time I use them, but that dye just kind of stays in these bristles. It's hard to completely clean it out. So that's why I like to keep them separate. This little brand right here of these paintbrushes, Crafter's Choice, is just a variety pack that I pick up from Tandy. But for the minimal paint work that I normally do, just a simple paintbrush like this will suffice. I don't want this video to be overcomplicated or confusing by any means, so to break this next section up, I'm going to try to do it in 3 simple categories, which are going to primarily cover prep work, application, and lastly, the finish work. Some of the most irritating issues we're going to run into are going to come in this finishing work stage, which is where I'm going to be talking about antiquing your projects. However, if we handle things properly during the prep work and application, we can usually limit those issues that come up in this third and final stage. So before we actually start putting paint onto leather, we want to make sure that all of our materials are properly prepped, starting with the leather. So if you're familiar with the type of work that I normally create, you know a lot of my projects are going to be carved and tooled or stamped, which means that water has been introduced into the leather. And that part of the project is always the first step. All of my carving and tooling gets done before I do any of the finish work. So after all of that has been completed, I let my project completely dry out before moving on to any of the finish work. Considering that this is how the majority of my projects go, the vegetable tan leather at this point in time is still pretty much a raw product. Nothing other than water has been introduced into the leather to alter it. So with that being said, I personally don't usually apply any type of deglazing solution or prepping solution to the leather. There are certain situations when prepping the leather properly with a deglazing solution or just cleaning the leather is absolutely necessary. But in this particular scenario, I don't usually feel as if it's do or die to clean the leather. In my opinion, it is a case-by-case basis on whether the product needs to be properly cleaned or deglazed. Take that with a grain of salt and go about it however you want. I'm just telling you how I personally go about it. If you are in a situation where your product needs to be cleaned or any top coats, sealants, or dyes have already been introduced to the leather, then absolutely prep it properly, or else you are going to run into more issues when you're trying to apply your paint, dye, or whatever else. But when the leather is pretty much raw and clean already, like I have right here, I don't personally feel necessary to implement that step. Another thing I want to mention that I have tried before, but I don't do it every time, is actually scuffing up the leather where the paint will be applied. So the theory is, just like you might scuff up an area where glue will be applied to give it a little something extra to hold on to, you can do that with paint as well. So if you take some very fine grit sandpaper or something similar and just ever so slightly rough up that area that is going to be painted, then that can promote the paint to actually hold on to something a little bit more rather than just sitting on top of a smooth piece of leather. So like I said, I don't do that often, but I have tried it before, so that is something to consider as well. Next, we want to prep our paint. Now, I personally thin my paint down quite a bit, and especially when it comes to applying these multiple thin coats, this has made a lot of difference in my experience. Angelus does have this thinning solution, and I will show it on the screen right now, but I've only recently started using this. I don't have a lot of experience with it. I'll put pictures up of their instructions on the product as well, but like I said, I'm not going to act like I have it down to a science because this is still a new product to me. Up until recently, I have mainly just been using water to thin my paint down, and when I say that, I literally just add some water to the paint bottle and shake it up until I get a consistency that I like. But it is important to know that you can thin this paint down too much, which will also create issues. So just be careful with that. But I do thin it down to a much more runny consistency than how the paint comes in the bottle when you first crack it open. So now we're going to actually move on into the application part of this main section. And as we look at the instructions on the bottle, like I said, they make it very clear that to get the best results, you want to apply multiple thin coats of this paint rather than just clumping together a bunch of thick coats. If you apply thick coats, that's when you're going to run into some of those issues that like clumping and streaking. So thin coats is the way to go. Especially since I thin my paint quite a bit, I'm already adding a very thin coat to start with. And as you can see in this video right here, the first coat that I'm applying is very thin. It almost just looks like colored water. But as it slightly soaks in and dries a little more, that pigment will start to show. This base coat is, in my opinion, the most important. Like I mentioned earlier, the majority of this paint is just going to sit on top of the leather, but we want to try our best to apply it in a way that it has a chance to actually soak into the leather if possible, which is why I do prefer to thin my paint down quite a bit and get good coverage on this first coat. After the first coat, especially with colors like white, you will more than likely still see some of that leather color showing through. But as we continue to stack those coats, you will start to see less and less of that leather color and more of the paint pigment. And if we reference the instructions again, you can see that 3 to 5 coats is what is recommended with at least 15 to 30 minutes of dry time in between coats. You really want to make sure that each coat has had a good chance to mostly dry and soak in before moving on to any additional coats. Stacking up those thin layers is what is going to help us maintain good coverage as we move into the final finishing stages. Some colors are more challenging to work with than others for whatever reason, so always use your own judgment on if you feel like you need to add more coats or not. But after all the coats are applied and you have good coverage, then you want to make sure to allow even more dry time for it to completely set up. If you have time to let the paint set overnight, then that is usually ideal, but I know most of us are usually in a hurry. Again, just use your best judgment, but you really want to make sure that that paint is completely dry before moving on. Now we're moving on into the finish work, and I want to show you some examples of what not to do, or what hasn't worked personally for me in the past. First and foremost, some of you guys may have seen that video I posted a few years ago covering how I finish my leather projects, oil, dye, and antique. And that is still a very relevant video, so I will link it in the description for any of you interested in watching it if you haven't seen it. Now, I didn't cover paint in that video because anytime paint is involved, I slightly alter my finishing methods. Now, that finishing method that I show in that video is still my most used and the most consistent process for me personally. However, one thing you will notice in that video is the first step of my finishing process after the project has dried from tooling is usually applying oil. But for me personally, if paint is going to be applied to a project, then paint takes over the first step of that process instead of oil. So kind of like I hinted at earlier in the video, I personally just like to add paint to leather with no extra properties already involved if I can do so. So adding paint before oil has previously given me slightly more consistent results, and that is just, again, my personal experience. You may be different, but for that reason, I do like to add paint before anything else if paint is going to be applied. But since I've covered that in this video now, after the paint is dry, I will just continue on with my usual finishing process, like adding oil or any dye if the order calls for it. But I have recently started adding things to my finishing process when paint is involved instead of just continuing on with resisting, antiquing, and so on. For anyone that's painted and then just went straight into lathering some tan coat or other type of resist on, you know that a lot of rub off can occur. And the same thing if you only apply a couple coats of paint or just a couple thick clumpy coats and then jumping into the resisting and antiquing, same thing, a lot of rub off will happen. So in my experience, the proper layering and adequate dry time goes a long ways in preventing near as much rub off throughout the antiquing process. So we want to really make sure that we apply those proper thin coats of the paint and allow adequate dry time before we move on. And here's an example I wanted to show you of a project where I didn't layer the coats like I should have, and I did just jump right into my normal finishing process without adding anything specifically to the paint beforehand. And you can see that throughout the finishing process, we lost a ton of that vibrant looking color and had a lot of rub off. If this is more of a look that you're going for and don't mind this kind of rustic look to it, then by all means go for it. But if you want to keep your paint that vibrant looking color, then this is no bueno. If you do run into this, it is not the end of the world. This is honestly how the majority of my projects went for a very long time. And I always just rolled with the punches and went back through and touched up the paint like you see here. And it did all end up fine. It adds more time to the project, but from my experience, I wanted it done a certain way, and so that is what I decided to do. So it is an option, but this is not ideal, especially if you're painting areas with a lot of details and you have already applied antique to your project, and you still want those details of that antique to pop, but you need to end up touching up all of those areas around the antique. It can be very difficult and really easy to get messy doing that, just like you can see on these feathers. I actually did layer these feathers fairly well and thought that I was going to have very minimal issues, but I still had rub off and more of that kind of dirty look than I wanted. So I had to go back and touch them up to my liking, which wasn't easy. The end result was still a really nice looking vibrant color, but it took more time than probably necessary to get that look. So what is the solution to that? Like I mentioned earlier, I'll be honest, I don't know that I do have a teetotal perfect solution, but something that I have been implementing here recently that has, in my experience, helped tremendously with preventing rub off during the rest of the processes and also kind of limits that dirty antique look on the paint is I actually go through and seal up the painted areas specifically with a stronger sealant or resist before I go through and add my normal resist to the entire project. This can be your product of choice. I am still experimenting with this as of now, but I will share with you what I have tried. Something very important to know though, if you are going to try this, is you want to make sure that all of your oiling and dyeing has been finished properly before applying any type of stronger resist if you are going to be adding those products. Because if you accidentally get some of these stronger products in areas where they don't belong, then they will actually block any oils or dyes from being able to penetrate the leather in that area and can leave really unwanted, ugly, splotchy areas. So after the oils and dyes are applied, they will be fine, but you really want to make sure that if you are going to apply those products, that you do it before adding any stronger sealants to the leather. But when I get to the point of adding top coats to the entire project to start resisting the full project, as if we're going to apply antique here in a minute, rather than jumping into the full coverage of that project, what I've been doing is taking one of these products here, and then I just like to use a clean paintbrush, and I have been lightly applying these products to the painted areas alone, not the entire project, just the painted areas alone. I like to add 2 or 3 coats with good dry time, and then plenty of dry time after all of those coats have been applied to let that fully set up. It's really important to know whether you decide to do this or go about it differently that you don't rub very hard on these painted areas, which is why I like to use a paintbrush. It's very gentle. If you decide to use a sponge or sheepskin or some other type of applicator, just make sure that you are lightly dabbing this product on instead of just sitting there and scrubbing and rubbing on the paint. The more you rub on the paint, the more rub off that you're going to promote, obviously. So even in the next steps, when you get into the resisting of the full project, the antiquing, so on and so forth, however you go about doing it, just make sure that you don't rub on those painted areas. I know sometimes that the antique can kind of give that dirty look on that paint. If you have to go through and try to clean it up, just be very, very careful when you're working on those painted areas. Again, the more you rub, the more rub off you're going to get. And these are the main products that I've been experimenting with. Obviously, there are more products out on the market. I haven't had a chance to try everything yet. So if you guys have any suggestions, then drop them in the comments because I'd love to know. This first one is Resin, which most of you guys know is a stronger acrylic top coat. And then I've also been using Pro Resist, which this has honestly been my favorite so far. And then I've also tried the Angelus 4 coat, and I have the satin sheen. They do have a few other options. This is just the only one that I've tried so far. But again, there is obviously a lot more products out there. I have not got my hands on the RTC yet, but that is another one that I'm going to try. And again, if you guys know something else or you have your own concoctions that you know of or have created, then let me know in the comments. And now the Pro Resist. This is actually another acrylic type finish, but from my understanding, its primary function is going to be resisting antique and stain for maximizing the color contrast. It says it right on the bottle, which honestly is why I think I have had the best results with this up to this point, because this product not only seals the paint in place really, really well, but it also helps keep that muddy antique look from discoloring the paint. Anytime I go through and add my antique and then start wiping it off after I've used this Pro Resist, I noticed that not a lot of that antique starts to seep into that paint and discolor it as much. That's just what I've noticed from my personal experience. So I go through, I add a couple coats of this, I let it dry, and then I just continue on with my regular Resist antique and then my cleanup, which is usually another coat of tan coat. And that's just what I've been able to get the most consistent results with. Again, I'm not going to say that this is my set in stone process. It's still far from perfect, but this is what I've been trying and honestly liking for my work. So I'm going to keep trying this, but I am still experimenting and trying new things. And as I start to wrap this video up, I have honestly been putting off making this video for quite a while, mainly because I haven't had that rock solid evidence of what does and doesn't work, and I didn't want to mislead any of you. Like I said a lot in this video, it's been a constant process of me trying new things and experimenting. I don't have it down to a perfect science, but this is a highly requested topic, so I just wanted to at least share with you what experiences I do have and let you know what I'm trying and hopefully help point you in the right direction or at least give you some new ideas to try. I just don't do much painting to have all the answers, so I'm sorry for that. I know there's a lot of you out there that probably do. And again, let me know in the comments what you guys think. But hopefully I was able to give you some type of positive guidance in this video, if nothing else. I do think it's important to understand, once again, that over time, rub-off is almost inevitable, especially on products that are going to be used and abused. Those painted areas, as they get rubbed and scratched, regardless of how good it was applied and sealed, at some point in time, whether that paint slowly wears down or just gets hit all at once, it's going to eventually get its toll taken on it. So it might be soon, it might be decades down the line. It is a case-by-case basis. Again, every product is used differently. But I do think it's important as makers to at least try our best to apply it in a way where we can promote the absolute best longevity of it. Here's actually a product that some of you have probably seen that I made a few years ago. This is a golf club cover, a putter cover specifically. It has my initials on the top of it, and they are painted in white. And most of you know I am a fairly avid golfer, and this cover has been through the ringer. It has been covered in dirt, mud. I've lost it on the golf course. It's been completely drenched in rain quite a few times. Usually when I take it off, I just throw it on the ground like you do any putter cover. So this has been put through it. I can promise you that. It's been heavily tested. And this paint has honestly held up fairly well. At the time that I actually made this cover, I don't think I was implementing any of these new techniques that I've been trying, and it's worked just fine. So go about it however you want. I just hope that throughout this video, some of the things I spoke about help you mitigate any of those issues that can come up, and hopefully just make your crafting experience a little more fun if you do decide to incorporate paintwork. If you'd like to watch a video over how I crafted this putter cover, then check it out right here. And if you got some benefit out of this video, guys, I would greatly appreciate it if you'd give it a thumbs up. And if you do want to see more leatherworking content, consider hitting that subscribe button. We just hit 20,000 subscribers, which I don't even know what to say. It's just really freaking cool, man. And I appreciate each and every one of you guys. But that's going to be all for now. Till next time, we'll see you.